Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Sutton. Hi to everybody online. Thank you so much for joining us on Teams. Hi to everybody who's coming into the room on this glorious Stirling afternoon. Whatever part of the world you're in, it couldn't be more beautiful than it is in Stirling.
Can you hear me?
I hope you can hear me and see me okay online. If there's a problem with the feed at any point, just drop a note in the chat and Ruth will monitor and let you know. For those of you in the room, as you've seen, there are mics and filming around, so please just don't chat away to each other as we go, and we'll go from there. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'm just going to say a word about the Centre for the Sciences of Place and Memory. This is one of our two memory summer seminars. So some of you have been to our events before, but for those of you who haven't, we're just sort of 6 or 7 months into a 5-year project funded by the Leverhulme Trust, to whom we are very grateful. We're studying foundational questions in memory, spatial cognition and place, and obviously today's talk by Donna Rose Addis is going to be one of our investigations into the fundamental, basic and applied sciences of memory. But we're also doing a lot of applied work, interdisciplinary work across technologies of memory and navigation, across collaboration in memory and navigation, and in, I guess, more social science areas, looking at problems about historically burdened heritage, our crises of commemoration and difficult past, and looking at urban policy and planning and cognitive ecologies of the city. If you're not signed up already, you can sign up to our mailing list at placememory.net and get information about future events with us. Okay, so for today's plan, Donna Addis is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and we'll have then go straight on into a Q&A session. We'll mix questions from those of you online, which Ruth will curate, and questions in the room. Those of you who are here are then very welcome to stroll down with us to the pub, the Meadow Park, just off campus, and continue the conversation over a quiet drink in the sun. Or if anybody's watching from Bridge of Allen, come down and join us as well. We're also very pleased to have this event being filmed. For the first time, we've got our team of great young film and media students. Thank you guys very much for coming in and helping us out with this. Okay, so it is a real pleasure for me to introduce Professor Donna Rose Addis, who is with us all the way from Toronto. This is the main gig on Donna's major tour of the UK. She's doing a side gig down at the Royal Society of London in a couple of days' time, but thank you so much for coming to visit us, and for this being your first trip to Scotland, right, at all. So Donna is one of the world's leading scientists in memory research, in autobiographical memory, episodic memory, and she's been one of the leading lights in this area since well before we first met, more than 15 years ago, back in Sydney, when Donna was based in Auckland. So Donna is Canada 150 Research Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience of Memory and Aging, and she's the Senior Scientist at the Rotman Research Institute at Baycrest Hospital in Toronto. Donna is of Samoan descent, did her undergraduate degree at the University of Auckland, got a scholarship to go to Toronto for her PhD, and then a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard University after that, which I guess was the period at which her work started to transform our understanding of the relation between past and future as represented in the brain. She then had a stint back at the University of Auckland running a lab there before taking up the current post as Canada Research Chair at Baycrest Hospital in Toronto. As well as the topic she's going to talk about today, Donna's research spans an extraordinary array of areas in psychology and cognitive neuroscience. Lots of recent work is in areas of health psychology. She's going to, I think, talk about some of her work on narrative and self, as well as on memory and future thinking, and on mood and emotion as well. Her record as a scientist is really stellar. I couldn't waste more of our time going through it, but I am really delighted to pass over to Donna to talk to you about the past and future of the imaginative brain. Please join me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, John, for that lovely introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here in Stirling and to see this fantastic new centre for the sciences of place and memory, and to be able to share some of my work on memory, and I think it really fits nicely with your sort of truth and memory theme when I was looking through some of the many things that you're focusing on here. So my career really started in terms of thinking about or looking at how the brain enables us to create a record of our past and to allow us to go back and re-experience specific events and episodes from our past. All right, but then in 2007, the field really took a bit of a shift into reconceptualizing memory as a system that allows us to also look at the other side of the memory coin. Okay, there we go, to imagine our futures and to imagine ourselves in these future experiences. So there had been some hints in contemporary memory research that there was this link between past and future. So early work by Tolving in the 1980s had shown that amnesic participants who obviously experienced great difficulty remembering events from their past, when asked what they might do tomorrow, okay, I'm not sure what's going on here.
Someone else is taking control of the presentation.
Okay.
Do you have?
There is a
Oh.
Yeah.
We
Okay.
need to just share it again. Take back, so you want to take back, yeah.
I wonder if it's because of this. It's never seen that happen before.
It's quite weird.
It's there. Can anyone
Is it down here maybe? The dots?
Yeah,
Okay.
good
All
work,
right.
Elsa, thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry about that. Or whoever took control, don't believe it. Okay, so talking about the two sides of the memory coin and how in work with amnesics, if you're asking them to remember the past, but also when you ask them to imagine the future, they will say things like, my mind is blank, and that this experience is very much like when they're asked to remember the past. And then it was really in 2007 that there was 3 studies that came out, all from labs around the world that didn't know that we were all working on this. And there was one study from Eleanor Maguire's lab at UCL looking at patients with hippocampal damage, and then 2 neuroimaging studies, by one from Carl Spooner and Kathleen McDermott's lab, and then one from Dan Schachter and myself, looking at the neural correlates of memory and imagination. And this really served to kind of galvanize this kind of reconceptualization of memory as being very related to future imagination. And so when we were looking at this, we took a standard paradigm from the autobiographical memory literature, where we give people single keywords and ask them to either recall past events or to imagine future events. They then do this for around 20 seconds on a given trial, and then they rate how much detail they were able to remember or imagine. And then afterwards, because we can't have people talking in the scanner, afterwards we do an interview with them to really, kind of confirm what they were thinking about while they were in the scanner. And using this type of paradigm, we were actually very surprised when we saw just how similar the patterns of brain activity were when people were remembering their past experiences versus imagining novel future experiences. And even though there was this, by and large, this very robust pattern of similarity, there was evidence of some activity that was specific to the future. And in particular, we found this in the right anterior hippocampus, which, really surprised us at the time, when, at that point we were really thinking about the hippocampus as a canonical brain structure for memory. And so to see it kind of more activated in what we had previously thought of as, kind of a non-mnemonic function, really sort of lent, really kind of, I think, spurred a lot of research to try and understand what's going on when people are imagining. So in terms of our theoretical framework, based on this research and other research that was coming out around this time, Dan Schachter and I proposed the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis, where we argued for the important role of episodic memory in imagining future events. And this arose in part out of Dan's decades of work on memory errors and memory distortions. So the idea that episodic memory is a very constructive system, a constructive process, that we piece memories back together when we retrieve them. But then this constructive nature lends itself to future simulation, where we can flexibly extract details from memories, and then we can either reintegrate these as they were in the experience from the past, or we can recombine these into novel combinations when we imagine future events. And then about 5-6 years ago, I wanted to kind of take a step back and situate this theoretical framework within the discontinuism debate within philosophy, and really, being influenced by John's work and others' work, to really think about episodic memory and its status as this very distinct or almost kind of special system in the brain. Certainly memory scientists view it as a distinct and important system. And I proposed that rather than episodic memory being co-opted for imagination, that there is a core simulation system in the brain that overlaps significantly with the default mode network. And it's this system that constructs all simulations, whether they're remembered past events or imagined future events. And so I drew on evidence that both past and future events incorporate similar types of content. So this could be episodic details, concepts, schema, and also imagined content. So when we recall past events, we often fill in details of things that we don't necessarily need to reinstate every detail in accurate detail. And that they're constructed using the same types of associative processes. So associations between features, associative schematic processes, and that schemas can be used to scaffold our simulations of events. So I'm going to talk more about some of the evidence that we have for this. And people will say, well, how do you know that, memories are memories and imaginations are imaginations? These must be different somehow. And so what I've argued is that they're different to different degrees. So I would say that they're not distinct natural kinds because they're using the same types of content and the same processes, just to differing degrees. And that we see other brain systems coming in to direct, to manipulate, to monitor or interpret the simulations that we create. So basically the main premise though is that simulations are fundamentally constructed in the same way. And so then we can think then about simulations as lying along a continuum, and I'm going to be talking a lot about these different event types today. But we can think about associative strength. So the details that we might bring together when we're remembering an event are likely much higher in associative strength. When we generate very plausible events, we might bring online chunks of associated details. But when we're getting to very novel events, they might be, have much weaker associative strength. In reverse, we might need more schema to support our ability to imagine very novel events that we've never encountered before, and so we're relying much more on general knowledge processes. This may not be as necessary when we remember past experiences. So just to give a little bit of an outline of this talk, first I'm going to talk about some of our evidence that we've accrued over the years showing the overlap of past and future events. I'm then going to talk about recent work that we've been doing, looking at schema as the template for future events. I'll then look at some work we've done on what makes the future memorable, and end off on something around false memory, so how imagination can create a false past. Okay, so first thinking about the overlap of past and future. So when we first published these results, the main comment that we got back from reviewers, from colleagues in the field, was that this overlap that we see in the neural correlates between past and future might reflect recasting. So the idea being that, well, when I imagine a future event, I simply take a past event and I put it into the future. I just kind of recast it. I don't change it at all. I'm not really imagining. So in both cases, I'm doing an episodic memory task. So we wanted to really show that, we wanted to come up with a paradigm where we could be sure people were recombining details and creating something novel. And so we came up with this experimental recombination paradigm. And so we would have participants come into the lab. This would usually take around 4 hours. We would have them recall around 100 memories, each with a distinct person, place, and object that they had to recall. So pretty intensive participation. We then randomly recombined some of these details for some trials. So you can see here when we're asking people to recall the past, the details are in the form, you know, it's reinstating what the set of details that they had in their actual past event. But for these conditions where we ask them to imagine the future or to imagine a past event that never occurred, we have combinations of details extracted from different memories. And sometimes these combinations can be quite weird because they really were just random recombinations. And so people came back and had an MRI scan about a week later, and they had to do these tasks in the scanner, so to recall the past event being referenced or to imagine novel events, and then rate these for how detailed they were. And so we were able to confirm in doing this that we see the same brain network activated when people are both remembering and when they're imagining in this way where we're sort of forcing them to recombine and we're preventing recasting. And indeed, the events people were generating in the imagined past and imagined future conditions were much more novel, rated as more novel as their recalled past events. And so since that time, there's been a lot more work looking at this. A meta-analysis in 2015 of 12 studies that had looked at past and future activation found reliable activity across many regions in the default mode network, and they're shown on this image in the black outlines. So we see medial prefrontal and parietal, lateral parietal, lateral temporal, and yeah, so basically all the major suspects in medial temporal lobe in here. And so, so that really kind of confirmed that we see this core network that gets activated no matter what kind of simulation you're doing. The next way in which we've looked at this is to ask whether there are when we have changes in memory, do we have changes in future thinking that accompany this? So really building off of the amnesic work. And so to start with, we did this in healthy aging. So we had 16 young and 16 older adults, and in these paradigms they have about 3 minutes to recall or imagine as much as they can about an event that's cued by the cue that they're given. And we then take these transcripts, we parse them into separate details, and then we classify those details as either episodic details that are about the main event that they're describing, or the non-episodic details. And so here's an example from a young adult. I imagine baking my first loaf of bread. It's the Friday before Yom Kippur. I get the recipe from an old cookbook. The room is hot even though we have the windows open because the oven is on in the middle of summer. The bright kitchen light is off and we light a candle. The BBC is on in the living room. And so you're really getting those internal details of what this event is like to experience. So it's very experiential. An older adult example here for the cue word toy. This person says, this reminds me of the toys our grandchildren have. I think they're spoiled. Our son, the teacher, doesn't have lots of money and his wife just can't say no to the kids. I generally give my son money for specific things. Like he had a problem with his knee, and so to help with the doctor's bill, I gave him some money and I wrote on the check, don't spend this on toys. And so you can see here, we have a very specific instance that this person is talking about, but they give us a lot of background information as well, so non-episodic information. And this is a finding that had been shown previously in other studies where for older adults in the darker blue here, they show a reduction in the episodic details that they generate and an increase in the non-episodic details. And so we've seen that in autobiographical memory. Now we've found exactly the same pattern for future thinking. So this reduction in episodic and an increase in non-episodic details. And when we look at the number of episodic details that people are generating for their future events relative to their past events, you can see quite a strong correlation here. And if we break down the episodic details that people are generating even further, we see that past and future events are comprised of very similar kinds of content. So there's a lot of event details, so this is the kind of plot, the action, the dialogue, the entities who are there. We see perceptual detail, place, time, and emotions and thoughts. So they're fairly similar to each other, irrespective of whether you're remembering or imagining. And more recently, we've done this in individuals who are at risk for cognitive decline to see whether they're showing similar changes as well if we move kind of one step towards dementia. And so here, this is a group we were looking at who were at risk of cognitive decline. They have a Montreal Cognitive Assessment score of less than 26. And our colleague had shown that they have mild atrophy in areas of the medial temporal lobe. And so we found basically the same findings that we'd shown before. Relative to healthy older adults, these individuals are showing reductions in episodic details, both for the past and the future, but they're generating about the same amount of non-episodic detail as their healthy, age-matched counterparts. So we're not seeing any difference there in their production of non-episodic details. And so to look at this in imaging, we used our standard paradigm where we're cueing people with single words and having them imagine events in the scanner and recall past events. And we also do a control task that's a lower level semantic type of control task where people are defining words and things like that. And so what we can see here is that there's overlap in past and future activity in both young and older adults in that default mode network. So you can see here, both young and older adults are showing increases in the warm color, so this is the brain signal for past and future events relative to the control task. So even though the difference between these two types of tasks is, it's larger in the younger adults than the older adults, you're still seeing this differentiation in the older adults.
Okay, then I've got to go and see board as well.
But we do see changes, and so one of the things we see is an age-related decrease in hippocampal activity. So in younger adults, you can clearly see that differentiation between the autobiographical task and the control task in the right hippocampus, left hippocampus, but in the older adults, there's no distinction between their brain signal, between the different conditions. And it doesn't matter whether it's past or future, both of these tasks are showing this effect. But we do see age-related increases, so they're bringing online other brain regions to support what they're doing, and this tends to be later in the trial and in lateral temporal regions. And so that's interesting because these are regions that support conceptual knowledge. So this kind of non-episodic details. And interestingly, if we look at what activity in the brain correlates with the detail ratings that they're making on every trial, we see in younger adults, this correlates with activity in the hippocampus, and so that's been shown a number of times before. In older adults, it's actually correlating with the signal in these lateral temporal regions. Okay. So just an interim summary from this first section. So I've shown you evidence of overlapping neural correlates even when people are forced to recombine and imagine. And we see corresponding deficits between past and future events in terms of reductions of episodic detail. And so we've argued that then this supports the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis, particularly that the default mode network looks to be the brain's simulation system. Okay, so turning to newer work that we've been doing to look at the role of schema as possible templates for future thinking. Schemas are a core feature of memory for past events. And this has been quite a heavy focus in the cognitive neuroscience of memory in the last decade or so. And they're argued to facilitate encoding by organizing incoming information. They guide retrieval, they shape how we recall experiences from our past. And so we were interested to see, if past and future events are basically the same types of simulations, we should see evidence of schema playing a role when people are imagining events as well. And we would argue that, we think this is likely to be the case, given that schemas are dynamic and adaptable cognitive structures, so they can, be used to define and constrain what is possible, what is likely, and they likely support this flexible recombination of details into plausible events. And in our everyday life, that's really what we want to be imagining, right? Not these kind of, sometimes our tasks are very contrived because we're giving people these random combinations of details, but in everyday life, schemas should be playing, a really important role. And so here I'm looking at two different types of imagined events that are sort of further along this continuum, both plausible events and novel future events. And so the way that we did this, so we had a modification or a modified version of that recombination paradigm. So here we're giving people combinations of objects, so a tractor and a tablecloth, with some kind of spatial location. And the spatial location is either congruent with those two objects, so a vineyard in this case, or it could be incongruent with the two objects that they're given. And so the idea here is that a location can serve as a schema for an event. It has a lot of information that goes along with it that can help us to do these kinds of tasks. And so here's an example of what somebody imagines when we give them the vineyard, tractor, tablecloth combination. So they're talking about going on a vineyard tour in France and going around, the old tractors driving on the land there, and then they go have wine on an old barrel with a tablecloth. And so you can see the person is able to really easily generate a pretty congruent and plausible narrative. In the incongruent one, though, this becomes a lot more difficult. They're working in a busy office, they go out for a cigarette break, there's a sign directing them to a yard, and it's completely empty apart from a napkin that's like blowing in the breeze or whatever. And so it's a lot more difficult to be putting these together. So my postdoc Isaac did a study collecting some narratives online, and so in total had 350 written narratives. And what he wanted to do was to use natural language processing to see if he could find a way to kind of quantify the schematicity of a narrative. So how, could he kind of identify the core schema within this set of words, basically. And so he used ConceptNet to identify the largest fully connected subnetwork within the narrative of words. And so then this gave him a measure of schematicity. And he normalized this by the length of the narrative. And so here's an example. I really like this because it just kind of makes a lot of sense to see how closely these words are to each other. And so you can see in this vineyard one and the congruent one, you can see vineyard, tractor, and tablecloth. They're all fairly pretty tightly clustered. I mean, tablecloth's a little further off, but when you compare it to the incongruent one, you can see these things are very spread out. And even yard and sign aren't even together. And so this is kind of an interesting visual representation or an interesting way to quantify the degree to how schematic a narrative is. And so he was able to show that congruent narratives contained more interconnected concepts, which we would argue are reflective of schema. So that's just one way we've tried to look at this. Another way that my PhD student Sabrina Valenzano is looking at is to use a different approach, which I'll show you in a second. So she used the same paradigm with 50 people in person this time, and she has 500 narratives that she collected. And she also then tested 21 other people where they did a schema description task. And so these people, she would give them the place, and she would say, okay, so how would you prepare somebody to go to this place? What would they, if they have never experienced this before? So basically trying to elicit a schema about the place. And so here, for example, for a vineyard, it has rows of grapes and vines and lovely gardens, and other information here that we could actually end up dividing into these different kinds of information that people give. So people tend to tell us about things like what the place looks like, how you're prepared to go there, so you should take your sun hat, and what do people do there. So you walk around the vines, you taste different wines, etc. It actually sounds a little bit like that other person's memory about, or imagination. And so this we collected these from, like I said, 21 people, and we're able then to use a technique called the universal sentence encoder, which uses large language models to convert text into multidimensional vectors that represent semantic meaning in a very complex space. And so here we're calling those three types of information a perceptual schema, a preparation schema, and an event schema. So we basically would concatenate all of the details from someone's schema that were about perceptual stuff, and then run that through universal sentence encoder, get a vector for that information, and so on and so forth. And so then what we end up being able to do is that we have those 21 versions of the schema descriptions for the three types, and we can take any event narrative that we got from our actual sample of participants and compute cosine similarity to get an estimate of how much that perceptual schema is represented in their event narrative. And we do other kinds of corrections for baseline similarity and things like that, which I can talk about later if people are interested. So in comparing these, the mean schema narrative similarity, which I'm showing here, on the y-axis for congruent and incongruent trials, what we can see is that for perceptual schema, there was no significant effect of condition, and actually no correlation with our people's ratings of detail and plausibility. And to us, that suggests that perceptual schema could actually be quite foundational, that people, are always generating perceptual information to a similar degree, irrespective of whether the scenario that they're generating is plausible or novel. In contrast, the preparation schemas were highest for congruent events versus incongruent events, and their usage predicted detail and plausibility ratings. And so here we argue that this actually does support our hypothesis that schema can enhance one's event construction and allow us to generate narratives that are much more plausible and much more detailed. And finally, looking at event schema, we see the opposite. So this kind of surprised us, went against our hypotheses. Now we're seeing this type of schema represented more in incongruent events, which sort of doesn't quite make sense. But interestingly, it correlates significantly with plausibility ratings. And so here we're suggesting that event knowledge is leveraged to integrate novel elements. And if you actually look at the narratives, a lot of the time what people are doing, if they have an object in an incongruent location, they have to come up with some kind of action or reason why that object's there, how they're going to use it in that location. And so it sort of becomes integrated in that sense. And people are kind of making sense of it. Okay, so we think our results confirm that, well, certainly they confirm that schema are evident in future simulations, and that hadn't really been done before. We're now doing work to look at, of course, past events and see if they're similarly represented in these simulations. But we think it's another way in which imagining events uses the same processes that we know already work in remembering, although this might be happening to different degrees, we're not sure, so that's our kind of next research directions. And something else that we're doing, we're now conducting a couple of studies to look at recasting as a template for the future. So what are ways in which you could take a past event and use that to imagine a future event? And we think in everyday life, people are probably doing this quite a lot. Particularly because, you know, if I think about what's going to happen, well, not right now because I'm away, but normally if I'm in my everyday life, what I imagine is going to happen next week is really probably quite like what happened last week. That's going to actually make the most sense for me to use that as a template for next week. So we're looking at that kind of process now. Okay, so thinking about, or turning to now memory for the future, one of the, a lot of work in autobiographical memory talks about the functions of autobiographical memory. And that's been quite a focus also with future simulations in terms of the idea of that this is an adaptive process, that if we can kind of troubleshoot and think about what are the obstacles we might experience when we hit some scenario in the future, we may be able to enhance our success in that situation. But in order for that to actually happen, we have to encode the kind of scenario that we troubleshooted, right? Or the lessons we derive from that, so that then when we're in that situation, we know what to do. So we wanted to look at what qualities of a future event might make it memorable. So if it's more detailed, is it enhanced by thinking of simulations that are comprised of more familiar elements, or is it the more plausible scenarios that are more easily encoded? So to look at this question, my PhD student Victoria McClelland, modified our experimental recombination paradigm. So we had the same situation where people generated around 100 memories in the lab. A week later, they came back into the lab and they did a simulation task. Here, they're only imagining future events in this study. And then they had a surprise memory test immediately after the simulation phase. And so we gave them 2 of the details and they had to recall the missing 3rd detail. So for instance, they might come up with the correct detail or they might come up with the incorrect detail, and then we can sort of categorize the memory outcome according to this. And around 50% of memories in this type of paradigm are correctly recalled, and we had actually also designed this to look in, to use this in the scanner, and so that was also a really important factor for that study, to get something where we got even numbers of remembered and later forgotten details. But we had modified this paradigm in a few ways. So just to make it harder on those poor participants that came into the lab, not only did they have to recall the 100 memories and details, we then made them make ratings on every detail that they recalled. So they had to rate how familiar they were with that person, place, and object, how emotional it is for them, and how personally significant it is. And then when they're doing the simulation task, they made ratings about the simulation as a whole. So is that how detailed was that event? How plausible was the event? And so then what we can do is take the memory outcome and build statistical models to see what factors about the event details or about the simulations are predicting whether or not that particular simulation is subsequently recalled. And so to start off with, we used a model that had the mean familiarity across the 3 details, the person, place, and object, the mean emotionality, and mean significance. And there we found it was really familiarity that was driving the effect. So we kind of honed in on that a bit more and looked at the different kinds of detail. Object familiarity had no effect. Person familiarity was very significantly predictive of subsequent recall. And location familiarity was trending. And I put this there because other studies from Arno Dargenbo and colleagues, for instance, have found that location familiarity does predict subsequent recall. And this is kind of an important point, I think, because there's been a lot of debate in this literature around, whether location and space is special, and it kind of, dovetails with work that is looking at that with respect to hippocampal function as well. So Eleanor Maguire's scene construction theory really, focuses on the fact that the hippocampus is doing space, and this is really the platform on which we build events. So there's a trend there. And then when we look at, when we put in the qualities of the simulation itself into the model, both event detail and event plausibility also significantly predicted the subsequent memory of the simulation over and above the person familiarity. And so just to show these plots of the effects that we're seeing in every individual here for person familiarity, detail, and plausibility. So with this work, we've shown that both the details that people are using to comprise their simulation, as well as how people are integrating those together, influence the memorability of future events. So now turning to, I guess, another kind of memorability of simulations, in another line of work, we were interested in how imagination might cause one to remember a past that didn't really happen, at least not exactly how they're remembering it. And so there's a lot of work looking at the idea of reality monitoring, of course, and this started with Marshall Johnston's very influential theory about the ways in which we can distinguish between perceived events and imagined events. And so the idea here is that there's many different kinds of heuristics we can use. Perceived events tend to have more sensory and contextual information versus thoughts and emotions. They tend to be more realistic. They have more supporting memories, whereas, for instance, imagined events are more based on reasoning. And perceived events tend to be faster and more fluent to generate or to recall, versus remembering imagined events is slower and more effortful. But I think what's really interesting, if you go and look at some of their original work, the perceived events were actually personal experiences, whereas the imagined events were simple simulations. So, imagining putting a cup on the kitchen bench or something. So they're very different in their nature. And so of course they have less sensory information, they're more unrealistic, or some of the things they were getting them to do were like weird dreams and things like this. So they were very different. And actually they themselves do talk about how you can have imaginings, and I think we all have this, experience every now and then where you have imaginings that are so detailed. It's very difficult to know where, re-representation ends and where fantasy begins. And so my student Aaliyah Devitt was very interested in the notion of autobiographical memory conjunction errors. And so this is when we mix up the details of our experiences. And so, this happens where you might be, remember the wrong person who came to a particular party and somebody pulls you up on that. Or it can have, quite important legal implications where you're perhaps mixing up, identities of people, two people that you interacted with on the same day and putting them in the wrong location. So what factors might contribute to the occurrence of these types of memory errors? Well, there's been a lot of hypotheses put forward or examined in the literature on false memories as a whole, so things like plausibility, detail, processing fluency, older age, and imagination inflation. And that's what I'm going to focus on these last two in these studies. And so we had them our participants did the same paradigm, but now what we did was sometimes we gave them partial recombinations where we gave them just one detail that was incorrect. And then sometimes we gave them 3 details that were from 3 distinct events. And in the simulation task a week later, they either had to imagine a past event that had never happened that incorporated the 3 details we gave them, or they had to rate the pleasantness of the 3 details. A little bit weird, right? To say that, your friend is more pleasant than your kitchen. But what we're doing there is not only are we exposing people to the details, we're actually getting them to relate them together. And so we felt that that was a very important control task to use. And then 1 week later, they would come back and they would do a recognition task where we would give them each of the sets of details and we'd say to them, are these 3 details from a real memory? Are they 3 details that you imagined a novel past event for, or are they new details that you've never seen, a new combination that you've never seen before? And so if they say that these are correctly, like if this is an imagined set like we have here, if they could correctly say it's imagined, they could say it's new, and so that would be a miss. But the ones that we're really interested in is when they say they're real. This really reflects a past experience that they've had. And then we actually go on and do free recall with people, and we have them we ask them to tell us everything they can remember about the event. Okay, so overall, we found about 5 of these memory errors per person. And what's really interesting is that 43% of those were maintained into free recall, where they would actually tell us about this experience as if it happened to them. And the rates of these memory errors were higher for the partial recombination, so just where we're substituting or switching out one detail. And I think that is more like what happens in everyday life. You kind of put the wrong person in the wrong place. You're not like sort of mixing up tons of details. And also, what's really important is that it was higher for the imagination task than the association task. So this tells us it's not just an effect of exposure or fluency, or even of relating those details together. It's something about having imagined a scenario with those details. And so the phenomenology of the events during the imagination phase was different for the detail sets or the events that led to conjunction errors. And so what you can see here is that the conjunction errors, the imagined events were more plausible and they were more vivid than the imagined events that they were later able to correctly reject or that they said were new. And then if we look at the memories that they actually retrieve in that second session, the ones that they say are conjunction errors in the magenta here are more like real memories than the ones that they can correctly identify as being imagined. So it seems like they're, once you get closer to it being like, the level of detail that a real experience has, it becomes more difficult to say whether or not it was imagined or real. And so breaking down the kinds of details that people were generating here, we see in particular that there's a difference between thoughts, so more thought content in real memories than conjunction errors and imagined events, more event details as well. But what's really interesting is this linear trend that we see here, where we have conjunction errors right in the middle, so they're more had more perceptual detail than the ones that people correctly rejected as imagined events. And then we look to see whether these effects are evident in older adults as well, and are they maybe inflated. And so what you can see here is that we do find evidence of that same difference between the imagination and the pleasantness association task. So older adults are showing evidence of this imagination inflation, but at an overall higher rate than the younger adults. And they're showing the same pattern in terms of real memories being higher in episodic details or vivid details than conjunction errors and correctly identified imagined events. So you're seeing the same thing there with older adults. Interestingly, this overall kind of ramping up or higher level of conjunction errors in older adults we link to changes in inhibitory control. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, so just to wrap up, today I've talked about evidence that past and future events share overlapping neural correlates and they show corresponding changes in aging. That schemas are important scaffolds for imagined events, providing a template for the future. Memorable associations memorable simulations are associated with more, I didn't talk about this, hippocampal activity during encoding, they are, and they tend to be more plausible and detailed and involve familiar people. And imagining vivid and plausible past events can inflate the rate of conjunction errors, and more so in older adults. And so I hope that together these different streams of evidence support this idea of constructive episodic simulation, that memories and imaginations are constructed by the same system in the brain, that they're comprised of the same types of content, and they're reliant on the same types of associative processes. And so I just want to thank my collaborators, in particular Dan Schachter and Reese Roberts, who I've done a lot of this work with, students in my current lab in Toronto, as well as students back at University of Auckland and my sources of funding, and to John for hosting me. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, great work, Donna. Thank you so much. We'll have Q&A now. If you're online, I hope you can raise your hand to signal that you've got a question, or you can pop something in the chat if you can't ask a question on Teams. We'll just see how that works. We can channel a question from anybody online who's got one. So anything to kick off in the room or online? Or do I get to go first?
There's one.
Oh, your question is yes.
I wanted to understand, like, schema is obviously playing a very important role in imagining and remembering, but if it's, like, what's its role in, let's say, forgetting? Like, how do we relate? Does it also play a part in, like, if we're forgetting, maybe our schema is not doing so well? Is that the case, or is it something completely different?
Yeah, so
the question for the people online.
Sure, yeah. So the question was whether schema might be playing a role in forgetting. So, so I do think, I think that's a really interesting question, because of course we know schema can lead to, certainly to memory distortions. So if we're sort of using a particular schema, that might bias the content that we then recall. But in terms of forgetting, I mean, based on what we've looked at so far, given that we see that certainly for future events that more detailed and more plausible events tend to be better remembered, you would think then the opposite for events that, it's the opposite for events that then get later forgotten, right? That they're less detailed, they're less plausible. And so if schemas are allowing us to generate more plausible events, then it does play an important role in kind of warding off forgetting, if you like. So you're building a simulation that is much more cohesive and coherent, and then you're more likely to be able to remember it. And I think you're kind of embedding it in embedding it more into a kind of existing knowledge structure as well. Yeah.
I think we have a question on Teams.
We've got Cecile has raised a hand.
So Cecile, I don't know if you're able to put your camera and audio on and ask the question yourself.
Yes.
If so, great.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Fire away.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. I'm a Jungian analyst. I've worked with past events and imagination, but dreams as well. I wondered whether you could say something about dreaming and how that fits in your research, whether you've done any work on this.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating area. Not something that I've personally done work on, but I've talked a lot with other sleep and dream researchers about this. And obviously there's lots of evidence for memory replay during sleep. And so if we think these are similar kinds of processes, are we seeing things that reflect, something around future imagination, or using details from your past experience and then maybe recombining those into some other sort of scenario that could maybe reflect future goals? And I think her name is Erin Walmsley in the US. She's doing some work looking at this and looking at how people are taking particular kinds of details and then sort of recombining them in sleep and in their dreams, and that these do kind of generally relate to goals that people might have. So kind of course a common one is if you're going to be giving a talk, and actually I did have one of these kinds of recombination things right before her talk the night before, so it's kind of been a very interesting hypothesis. So yeah, so I think there is some work starting to come out on that. I mean, obviously a very challenging area to look at, but I think very fruitful. And if we think of dreaming sometimes as well as kind of being this recombination of details into, well, sometimes then more bizarre kinds of combinations, not always, but sometimes, that then maybe it's this kind of, we're not having the same kind of control processes sort of guiding the simulation, or the schemas maybe aren't so fully enmeshed, and that you're getting sometimes these kind of bizarre things, but oftentimes they're, they kind of make some sense.
Could I please ask you to have the detail of the person you just mentioned? I didn't quite catch the name.
Oh yeah, her name is Erin Walmsley. I can send, if you send me an email later to John, I can send you the information.
That would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So we have a question here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Shreya. I'm an MSc Psychology student here at Stirling. And my question is around collective memory and recall, which is tied to particular events. And how does individual difference play a role into it? If you have a group of people who've experienced something together,
Right.
then the recall around that would be quite different for each person. So any comment on that would be super helpful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we have started doing some collective memory work. And in the work that we've done, we've been looking at lifetime periods, so how you recall a particular phase in your life. And so actually we were doing this during the pandemic, and so we would have people telling us or getting them to write a brief paragraph or a chapter, if you like, for a history book about the pandemic or for their own autobiography. So kind of to get at the collective experience versus their own personal experience. And we had people do this repeatedly over about 18 months during the pandemic. And what was really interesting is that over time, the collective and the autobiographical started to merge or become more similar to each other. So it was almost like you're sort of becoming less idiosyncratic with time, and you're kind of becoming a little bit more kind of prototypical, if you like, around certain things. And when we looked at the actual topics that people were generating in these narratives, to begin with, earlier on, you'd have certain kinds of things that were really timely or important at that time, like online education had a huge peak early on in the collective narrative. By the end of the pandemic, it was gone. People just weren't even talking about it. And so it's kind of interesting seeing how those things change over time. But certainly that maybe with more distance, you get more of this kind of prototypical narrative that kind of emerges, and maybe less of the idiosyncratic, like this was my part of that collective experience, and kind of just having more of like, here's the collective experience overall. So we haven't looked at this for specific experiences, only for these very long kind of times where you're sort of living through it. But we're actually going to start looking at this. We just got Carl Spooner and I just got a grant to look at this also for perspection. So how you imagine like what it's like to be retired or what it's like to be a parent. And to start with, when you're further out, you're much more prototypical because you only have schematic knowledge or general knowledge to rely on. And as you get closer, it starts, we hypothesize that you'll start to get more idiosyncratic. So yeah, I hope that kind of speaks to your question a bit.
At the back.
A very broad question.
imagery. It's interesting because I think we focus on it a lot in a lot of tasks, but I'm actually kind of more, I guess, I'm not as wedded to the fact that that's necessarily the core of everything or that it's fundamental to everything. You know, I think certainly some work from aphantasia is starting to suggest that. But also, I think a lot of what we've looked at in our work are these kind of more narrative forms of memory as well. So how people tell stories about their past, and particularly life stories. So that's another line of work that I look at is the representation of the self in life stories. And even these kind of, when you think back to a lifetime period, sometimes it's not about visual memory, or visual imagery. It's really about the mood or the feeling of, you know, being that undergraduate at university where, you know, everything lies ahead of you and there's all this feeling of like excitement and novelty and promise and stuff that then in middle age you kind of lose. But you know what I mean? So there can be different kinds of memory representations that might rely, well, I think do rely more heavily on different kinds of details or different kinds of systems.
This is a super left field question, but maybe it is a speculate. Do you think my dog has imagination?
So Endel Tolving would say, no, your dog doesn't. My dog might have no. But yeah, what would I say? I think they probably have some kinds of imagination, or maybe some kinds of perspective.
It has a hippocampus.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm certainly not opposed to it at all. And yeah, I mean, I think there can be, again, different kinds of degrees of imagination. I mean, certainly there's work like that Nikki Clayton has done in terms of scrub jays and looking at, you know, their kind of ability to think prospectively. Whether, you know, and I guess it kind of depends on what we define as imagination, right? Does it have to be this kind of, these sorts of simulations that I've been talking about today? Animals might be forming some kind of mental model, what they probably are, some mental model of what is going on, the understanding of their experience, and I don't see why they couldn't be doing that for the future.
Well, you kind of touched on your neuroscience a little bit, but you know, if you just be real parsimonious about it, you know, it has memory, it has perception, it's got those same brain structures. Okay, it doesn't have language, kind of, but
then you could do
it's
other
a weird
kinds of,
it's a weird thing to say. Okay, it has that, but it doesn't have the flip side of it. That's what my point is. Thank you.
Marco, did you have a question?
I have many, but I was describing, but I have many. So I play one. Apologies for misremembering probably the study from Bartlett. I read it so many book Remembering 1937. If I remember correctly, there was a study of people reading Native American stories and then recalling. According to schematic knowledge, only a very limited amount of information compared to the richness and also misremembering. So my question following, I am familiar with your instructor's work and I really buy into the constructive episodic simulation. Today probably for the first time, I don't know why, it made me think, well then the question, back to what, never thought about this. How do we know that the schema or the schematic infrastructure was operating in recollecting and not in the first perception of the imagining? So how do we know that actually they were not imagining schematically, therefore accurately remembering the experience, instead of having this experience which was richer and then having a schematic recollection?
Okay.
If it even makes sense. I think there is something there, but...
Yeah, I think I might.
So, I mean, it's like conventionalization happens at encoding, is my suggestion.
Yeah, so
well, so actually I have argued that the same kinds of processes, like where this process of building a mental model, like a situation model or whatever you kind of want to call it, some people call it event model, of your current experience, that's happening at perception too, right? And then we would be, well, I would argue, and others have argued, that you encode that whole mental model. And so to me, then that includes all of your internally generated content, as well as how schema influences your perception of what you're understanding, right? That is a huge part of like, not only how you kind of do predictive processing, but then also how you understand and kind of as you're accumulating knowledge in this experience that you're in, how you kind of understand that, how you evaluate it, all those kinds of, how important it is to you, all of those kinds of processes are also, coming into play there and shaping what it is that you encode in the first place.
So in a way you're saying, basically, I guess it's difficult, since I'm working on narrative theories, I work on imagination among other things, and it becomes then quite difficult to assess whether the schematic filter is operating in the original imaginative experience or in the recollection of an imaginative experience.
Yeah. I kind of think they're
you could do
operating
an
it all.
memory test and then compare it after 2 again. I suspect, I think Barbara may have done that on some of the Chris.
Oh, right.
And then,
Thanks very much. I suppose I always come from these things from another direction, but because I'm an architect and working with John in the place of memory. But it seems so striking, some of the kind of methods that you were using there, in the same way that we would consult with communities and the way we would ask them to think about a place and how they might change the place because we'd be working with them in that. And we would purposely ask them to, what would you change, what would you remove from that space? We'd also ask them to take on the personas of that place, be it a bridge or be it a square or whatever, what they might enhance, but what they might actually add to that space as well, which I suppose is the kind of future bit, because the other thing, it's a historical thinking about the past and the memories of that place, and people do that. My question was going to be, because they would always be visual, because we would have to use prompts of some sort, we'd have to use precedents. All our precedents would be quite fantastical. We'd be showing squares in Barcelona or Berlin or whatever. But all your examples seem to me that you were trying to avoid that, and you were trying to be kind of like more realistic. At any point, did you ever kind of like put forward quite an ambitious kind of,
like more fantasy type?
I wouldn't say fantasy because you can't achieve these things, but more ambitious kind of like futures.
Yeah, that's interesting. We haven't done that. Others have done stuff looking at kind of climate change, for instance, so a different future, kind of getting people to think out of the bounds of their current reality to something that is quite different, with the idea that maybe that could change or sort of bring the future closer to people. So there's that kind of idea. I don't know if that's sort of along the lines of what you're thinking, or?
I know I did perhaps have a question. I didn't see your placement at the end when I think we were talking about conceptual. They all seemed exactly the same. All the 3 bars were bang on the same, I thought, which was quite interesting. But we also do use creative non-fiction to engage with the communities, because it's very hard to engage with communities and trying to then gain some knowledge from those writings that they do. I thought it was kind of fascinating what you suggested there. But I'm wondering if we should be less ambitious and maybe a bit more commonplace in the things we're asking.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think, some of the work on these kinds of, just thinking about work on the default mode network that looks at perspective taking. So even when you sit there, like imagining yourself being a bridge in this particular spatial location or place, and you're sort of like getting people to take other perspectives or viewpoints, that is also part of this process, right? I think that is kind of, and I think that's kind of an interesting sort of way to connect to that maybe. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have another question online.
We've got one that's come up before from Pablo. I can read it.
Yes, thanks, Ruth.
So Pablo says, thanks very much, Donna. I was wondering, do you think there is a difference regarding the metacognitive processes surrounding memory and imagination? It strikes me that the norms for evaluating memory versus imagination are quite different. For example, accuracy versus plausibility. And I wondered if these corresponded to different metacognitive processes.
Yeah, interesting. We've mainly, our work is mainly focused on construction, so how people construct future events, and so then the kind of metacognitive or cognitive control aspects of that. So how people engage in relational reasoning, how people might even kind of modify or create new schemas in order to then direct their construction of future events. So it's kind of a different focus from what Pablo is kind of referring to there. We haven't really done anything on the kind of reality, monitoring idea, like how you can tell if something's accurate or, using plausibility to help you with that maybe. And I think part of the reason why is that a lot of the time with how we look at autobiographical memory, for instance, is like, it's so hard to verify what's actually real in an objective standpoint because it relies in the first place on what you encoded, and that relies entirely on like the mental model that you built at the time, which is this kind of interaction between where your attention was, what you perceived, and also then your internal cognitions at the time, other kinds of information you bring to bear on that, your understanding. And so then in that kind of autobiographical, kind of space that I tend to be situated in, that hasn't been something that's been, a major kind of focus of research. But I do think, there probably are different processes, at play there. That's kind of where I've sort of, argued, I guess, within this kind of discontinuum debate, like if there's going to be differences, I think it's outside of this sort of how you build the simulation or the system that kind of constructs that event model.
Thanks, Pablo. And online, Paul, did you have a question? Are you still with us? Paul is running around in Marseille, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks,
Hello.
Paul. Go for it.
Yes, I'm in Nice actually.
Ah.
Tough. Yes, and I have to move. Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation, and it's groundbreaking to think that memory and imagination are kind of the same process. But I was listening to your presentation on the role of place and space, and so would you agree with this sentence saying that do you think we never leave space? We're always trapped in space?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there had been a study that Morris Moscovich and Jessica Robin did in Toronto, where they had people, they asked them to imagine a space and then kind of build a simulation, or they had to imagine the person and then build the simulation. And what they found, anecdotally, that people reported that they could never just have the person like floating in space. They had to put them in a place. And so then one of my students, in conjunction with my collaborator Reese Roberts, did a study where we actually kind of looked to see whether we could find a switch cost. So what I mean by that is that we had people, we gave people a location, and then we gave them a person, like in kind of in a sequenced kind of task. So they had to imagine the place, they then had to imagine the person in that place, and then, we looked at their reaction times for that. But if we did it the other way around, if we gave people a person, and then we specified the place, obviously the place that we give them is going to be different to any place that they spontaneously generate and have that person in. And indeed, there was a big switch cost once we specified a place for them to have that person in. It took them a lot longer to do that than to have the space first and just put the person in there. So there definitely does seem to be some kind of different role, I think, that space plays in these. In terms of, though, the hippocampal kind of contributions to this, we have sort of argued that a more parsimonious explanation than, Eleanor Maguire has always sort of argued that the hippocampus was really just doing place when it came to, scene construction, and that this was kind of different from then simulating other kinds of details, whereas we were kind of arguing that, if the hippocampus is a relational structure, that does these kinds of, associative processing, a more parsimonious explanation is that it does all kinds of associations, be that, the associations that you need to create a space, and also to put the details in that space and to have the event unfold over time. So we kind of think it does all of those things rather than just space.
Let me just jump in there. I mean, my question was similar about the way that you coded schematic knowledge in the second set of studies, so where you divided perceptual from preparation from event schemas, and I wondered if what you're calling perceptual schema kind of is place.
It is.
knowledge a lot of the time, and a little bit like the location familiarity in the third set of studies. Is that right? So that can be more stable perhaps than the other bits of schematic knowledge. So
because it was always there, regardless of whether it was congruent or incongruent. You and it was one of the higher, more strongly represented of those schemas.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, is there one more question online?
There's another 2 questions.
Oh, great, thank you, Ruth.
So
We have time.
from Armando, 2 questions. If the default mode network has more activity at times when the individual is not focused on any task or stimulus, does this mean that it is a neural substrate that gives rise primarily to involuntary episodic memories and imagining the future? That is, does voluntary episodic recall appear as a more secondary outcome?
Interesting. Yeah, so the default mode network actually in the 90s, when it was first talked about as first by Nancy Andreasen as, she called it the REST network, but she meant random episodic silent thought. So when you're not doing anything else, you're remembering, you're imagining, you're thinking, oh, I've got to go and pick this up on the way home, and oh God, that awful conversation I just had in the hall with, my friend, or you're kind of doing this sort of remembering and imagining. And then we had started doing research on autobiographical memory. So then it became known as the autobiographical memory retrieval network. This is still years before it became the default mode network. And so there we're seeing greater activity when we do tasks that actually then engage this kind of in a voluntary, intentional way. We ramp that network up even more. So in our studies, when we do neuroimaging, you have to have some kind of comparison task, and you'll note, or you might remember that my comparison task was a semantic, sentence, word definition type of task. And that is because that doesn't engage the default mode network. It has to be, some other kind of thing, because if we compare against rest, against fixation, when people are able to do whatever, they remember and they imagine, and so it makes it very difficult for us to compare against that. So I think we can kind of take away from that this is a very dominant form of thinking that we engage in at all times. We can either be doing this in a more involuntary, spontaneous way, or we can ramp it up when we have particular goals or reasons to do that.
We have got one other question. Developmental psychology work indicates the importance of joint narrative between caregivers and children in the development of autobiographical memory. Do you see this as a source for schemas operant in remembering and also in imagining the future?
That's really interesting. I have not really thought about that and from a developmental perspective. If you think about your parents giving you a kind of way to understand the world, then maybe, and clearly they're going to be a major source of forming the knowledge that you accrue to form schemas, then that will be, definitely one source of that. That would be very interesting to look at. Yeah.
Talking about it lunch today, I think definitely.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, we're on time. Thank you so much for everybody online and here. Just before I ask you to join me in thanking Donna for her talk, again, you're all welcome to join us wherever you are in the world. If you can get to the sunny terrace at the Meadow Park, 5 minutes walk just off campus, we'll be having a quiet drink there in a few minutes. I also just want to remind you and advertise our next talk in the Summer Memory Series, exactly 3 weeks today, in this room, Thursday the 5th of June, we have Celia Harris, who's going to be giving a talk on memory scaffolding, theory and practice. That will cover a lot of issues in theory and experimental work, including work on dementia and memory in older adults as well, so please join us for that. But for now, thank you so much, Donna, for coming to Scotland and for giving us your first talk in Scotland. Thank you, it's been great. Great. Thank you to the film crew as well.